Well, this is a special podcast to me, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I have one of my favorite patient advocates on this show that she's going to assume the microphone and she's going to be my interviewer. She's going to be the host of this Healthcare Unfiltered podcast. And it's also special because I get to talk a little bit about my book that was a labor of love that I wrote, which is called The Cancer Journey. And I think for folks who listen to my podcast, they realize I really don't do a whole lot about myself because the podcast is not about me. It's always about the guests and about the listeners. But I think we'll make an exception, Kelly. Every so often, it's okay to talk about myself if I wrote a book. So I'm making an exception today. So apologies for listeners and viewers who do not want to hear about me. If you don't, this is your opportunity to actually stop listening or stop viewing, because we are going to talk about the book that I wrote. And I couldn't honestly think of a better person than my dear friend Kelly Ryerson to be my guest host, I guess. So Kelly, welcome to the Healthcare Unfiltered. You've been on both sides. You've actually,
I have been on both sides.
I know.
Thank you. Thank you so much for handing the reins over to me. This has been so much fun. I love putting you in the interviewee seat.
Yeah, but you have to tell people who you are first and how we met.
Okay. Yes. I'm excited first to read your second book because your first book was so good and it spoke very, very closely to me because I met Chaddy when we were both involved in the Monsanto Roundup trials, where he was testifying as an expert witness as the oncologist. And I was writing a blog at the time called Glyphosate Girl. And I was staying very anonymous because I was worried about Monsanto coming after me. And so I was only known as Glyphosate Girl, and I wrote an article about Chaddy. And then later on through the different trials, we got to know each other, and it's just been a pleasure to see all that he achieves and all the different things that he's up to. And so when I heard that he was going to be up writing a second book, I first of all can't believe how prolific this man is, because he does this podcast on a regular basis. He works, and he has now two books out, and I think that that's pretty phenomenal.
Well,
So I
you're
would love to ask you some questions about it.
You're very kind, but and I think you didn't do yourself justice, by the way, telling people you're a fierce patient advocate. Obviously, you're focused on environmental and Roundup and things like this, but aside from this, it tells me that how much this matters to you in letting people know, being informed. I mean, frankly, a lot of things, what I've learned about the glyphosate trials that I was part of is that people should be aware. They can make their own decisions. I mean, everybody is adult and free to make choices. But what's really important is that to make choices, you have to know, so you make the decisions. And there were a lot of information that were not shared with people, so to make choices. So you spend a lot of time advocating for patients. You've gone to I think did you go to Congress at some point? Was it the EPA? You've gone to Washington. You've done some stuff there.
I've done, and I really, that's my focus now, is lobbying in DC to try to get the corporations off of our back of forcing some of these environmental toxins that are making us so sick, to be more regulated, and for there to be greater understanding of what these different chemicals can do to us. So I had a congressional briefing last year where I was talking about the effect of the contaminants in our food supply, in our water supply, and went then door to door to many of the congresspeople and senators, meeting with their staffers to explain the different kinds of legislation that we need to have put in place. And particularly as we come up in the year of a farm bill, where actually pesticide manufacturers are trying to get immunity from lawsuits because of this whole Roundup situation where Bayer is worried they're going to be bankrupted. So they're trying to take the power out of our hands to sue them, which is very frustrating because you have a lot of cancer-ridden patients from these exposures that then would no longer have any kind of recourse or a way to get compensated for their losses.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's actually a topic for a podcast we should do and talk about, because it's been a while since we've done an update into what's happening there. But anyway, I really appreciate you accepting the guest host function. And hey, the microphone is yours. Do whatever you want with it.
Okay, excellent. So why don't you tell me first? I think everyone would love to know what is the flavor difference with your new book? So we probably a lot of your listeners have heard or read Toxic Exposure. What is your book, The Cancer Journey, and why do you call it that?
Yeah, so I wanted to write a book. So toxic exposure was basically based on true medical slash legal thriller, if you will. It was describing the stories of three patients or four plaintiffs and three trials and depositions and courtroom drama and how I was in the mix of this. So it was a true story of the intersection between medicine, law, corporate, acquisition, business, all of these things. This is none of that, but this is about trying to reach patients, families, or people who want to know about cancer and learn about cancer in a way that allows them to understand the disease as an entity, regardless of where the disease originated from. And I wanted to do that through storytelling. I did not want to write a textbook. There's a lot of these out there, and some of them are boring. They could put you to sleep. People react more to stories, and they can picture themselves in that story. They could be that individual sitting in the chair talking to the doctor, and they can imagine that dialogue that's happening. So I wanted to really write something to help patients, families, anybody interested with this. And I tell you, Kelly, one of the things that enlightened me, that motivated me to do this, stemmed from my experience. When I was on the stand, and I wrote this in Toxic Exposure, there are many times I had to simplify complex things to jury of lay people. These sometimes 12 men and women or 16, they're not really specialized in cancer, and they had to understand everything in in right away so they can make a decision. And explaining to them all of this in a simple language that made them understand made me recognize that maybe I'm able to do that broadly. Maybe I should be able to explain that to many more people who would be interested in knowing this. And lastly, and I'll shut up, I promise, one thing that's really critical is a lot of times when people are diagnosed with a form of cancer, they will go to Google and they say, what is breast cancer or prostate cancer? They look for the cancer that they're affected with. I did not want to do that. I wanted to write something about cancer as a concept, as a disease. I did not want to write only about breast cancer or prostate cancer or non-Hodgkin lymphoma, or I didn't want to do that. I want to write something about cancer. And if you are someone who's interested in this disease, there's a way to learn more. If you learn more after reading it than what you knew before you read it, then my mission is accomplished, because there's a lot of information out there, but I wanted to put it concisely in one place. I called it a journey, although some people may not like this, because it is a journey. It is a path. It doesn't mean it's actually a good journey. It doesn't mean it's something we enjoy. Nobody really enjoy being ill or sick. Nobody wants to get sick. And in my introduction, I literally say that. I say none of us want to get sick. And if we want to get sick, none of us want to get cancer. But if we're forced to have it, then we are asked to walk a path with this illness. And if we're going to walk this path, I did not want the patient and the family to walk alone. I wanted to be alongside them, trying to provide more information, more guidance as much as possible in a very easy and simplified language. This is not complex. You should be able to read it and understand it if you're in middle school.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm reflecting because my mother-in-law was diagnosed now probably 8 years ago with lung cancer. And it was the first exposure I had firsthand to a family member having cancer. And what one does when they first get that knowledge and it's new information can be a scary, very dark time. And you're suddenly calling all your friends that have dealt with cancer to try and get any kind of tip that you can find, and what are the latest treatments and all that. Is that the kind of thing that you're addressing in this book?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at if I look at the chapters that I have after the introduction and the usual stuff, my first chapter is called "What is Cancer and What Causes It." The second one is screening for cancer, which is again before someone is diagnosed, they have to maybe screen. Then you have symptoms and signs of cancer, then making a diagnosis. Then the first oncology visit. What happens as you wait for that first oncology visit? Unfortunately, you get diagnosed, you're not going to see the oncologist the next hour. You make an appointment, they say come back in 10 days. Well, what happens during those 10 days? You're really going crazy. I mean, I've seen that. And I think it's critical to prepare the patient for the first oncology visit. I go over staging, second opinions, clinical trials. Then I go over various therapies: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, hormonal therapy, targeted therapy, immunotherapy, bone marrow transplant, cellular therapy. And then I go into complementary therapy and alternative therapy. These are questions patients care about, and physicians should not dismiss that. If somebody comes and asks you about music therapy or vitamins or diets, you can't be nihilistic about it. You have to really address it. So if you're a patient, this matters to you. And that's really important to address. And then I go over managing side effects, palliative care, hospice care. And one of my favorite chapters is chapter 20, which is called communication. And I wrote stories, several stories about situations where I felt I failed patients' communication, and others where I felt I did a good job. And I think it's important to never ever feel that you can't improve on certain things. It keeps us humble and grounded. If I felt I did a great job communicating with a patient, but my patient did not feel that, then I failed the patient. Just because I feel I did a good job, that doesn't really, it's not enough. My patient on the opposing end must feel that I've actually done that good job. I have to earn that. And there are times where I believe I fell short, and I wrote about that. And I think it's important to reflect on that.
That's such a universal sentiment, the failure of communication. Only for most people, it doesn't mean that someone's life is on the line. So the stakes are a lot higher.
Absolutely. It's not, think about it from a patient perspective. You get diagnosed with this life-altering illness. Look, any illness is life-altering. Autoimmune disease is not fun to deal with, all of these things. But cancer specifically has a different flavor. Let's face it, it's just one of those things where you hear the diagnosis and you feel it's over. Hopefully it's not over, but that's how you feel as a patient. And now you're going to meet a new person, new doctor, for the first time in your most vulnerable time in life. And that individual you have to establish trust with right away and put everything in their hand. That's not easy. I mean, you're suddenly surrendering lots of the control, and you have always control and power into making decisions. But the reality is, I write several stories on this where I took care of patients who they struggled because they were losing control, because the decision making is not always theirs. They don't feel it's theirs. I mean, if you have a leukemia and you gotta get chemotherapy, sure, you can refuse chemotherapy, but you know what that means. So you don't feel you have that power of saying yes and no. You feel I gotta just do what they tell me. So the physicians need to understand that, and we need to earn that trust, that respect, so patients can feel confident that we are doing everything possible to help them.
What happens in communities where there's just a couple of oncologists managing a whole community of cancer-ridden patients? Because what you're talking about sounds like it's almost a luxury to get you as a doctor to even be thinking about these things and to have the focus and the energy to be considering what your communication is. And I can imagine as a patient that a lot of times you do feel, particularly depending on who's delivering the news, that you're being ordered to do something. And now, hey, we're going to inject this poison into you, which effectively is chemo. and you don't really have a choice because it's life or death. And so that has to be so incredibly delicate. And I don't know if it does vary based on locations. You've met a lot of different oncologists, what their experiences are, but just curious.
Yeah, I think if you live in a community where there's not a lot of access to so much state of the art, the hope is that the physicians that are caring for you have access to information and to people to consult with if they're not familiar with your case, and that you hopefully can go elsewhere if you're not satisfied where you are. And there's a whole chapter on called second opinions. And I've always encouraged that. And I've seen people who came to see me as second opinion, and I've sent people out for second opinions. I think you're right. Sometimes the type of care as well as the quality of care could be based on geography. Unfortunately, even in the United States, we have many underserved areas, and we have areas where people don't have the best access or the best ability to get things like this. I wish this was not the case. And I have a lot of respect for these small community oncology practices in certain areas and locations where they have trying to do their best despite limited resources. I think the solution is to, sometimes to try to bring as many resources as possible. And I think that right now with technology, um, access to newer things could be easier virtually. So, I mean, if I'm a doctor in a very rural area, I should be able to communicate with somebody who is in different area and ask for opinions and things like that. I think it's gotten better in terms of getting these consultative services, I believe. I don't know if I answered your question, but I presume.
Well, yeah, because it seems like this book would be extremely valuable to people that don't have good access to doctors, or the wait is going to be exceptionally long. It just could be quite a comfort, I would think, to read the information you put in the book.
Yes, I mean, and they will learn more. I really put myself in the patient's shoes, and the one that I talk about, the first oncology visit, was really something I wanted to make sure that that I mean, we all are patients. I mean, at some point, we all, and having cared for these patients, I really felt for everyone. And I literally, in that particular chapter, the first sentence I wrote, the anxiety and anticipation of that first oncology visit cannot be overstated. And I talk about, what goes through the mind of a patient until they see that oncologist. And my view was to help that patient realize that during that time of waiting, there's a lot of things that you could do to cope with what's happening, so you are very prepared for that first oncology visit. And I can tell you there
What
are
kinds of things?
yeah. I mean, I think that is really important. I mean, I actually put in, while waiting for the appointment, my suggestion is to do the following. One, I said, read about your cancer. And I put in resources like why is it really important? I do mention there are a lot of bad information out there, but a lot of good information out there. So I actually talk about how the person should read about their cancer. Prepare your medical history. And I explain why preparing that medical history and being organized is going to be very important. Bring your medications, make sure the medications are really available. I do talk about develop coping skills. I think that's really critical, and I talk about the way that someone needs to develop these coping skills because we all need them. And I share my personal stories. One time I had to do a CAT scan, and as you're going through the machine, you're thinking, what am I going to do based on the results and all of these things? How am I going to really cope with this? People, Kelly, by human nature, they always feel invincible until something happens to them. If you're healthy and feeling well, you always feel, I'm going to be fine. And then something happens and you realize you're not fine. It always happens to the person next door, to my neighbor, but doesn't happen to me. The reality is we're not invincible. So I talk about coping skills. Then I talk about sharing the diagnosis. Do you share the diagnosis? Do you not? And I go through the pros and cons of this. Then checking the insurance, and then I go through what does the first oncology visit look like when you go into the doctor's office. So I'm taking the patients through the entire step, but certainly I put it out there. I know you're going to be anxious. I know you're going to be nervous, but let me tell you why you should take a deep breath and think about other things until you get there.
Mhm. Is there any story that's particularly meaningful to you? Any particular patients that have stuck with you that you've included in the book or not?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've included a lot of stories based on what I'm trying to illustrate. So, I mean, obviously, in the chapter of communication, I talk about stories of communication. I talk about a lot of other things. I think one of the stories that I always it's close to my heart, and I do talk about this, is in the chapter of survivorship. And I've noticed that in some patients who have what I call survivor remorse. I cared for a patient who was much younger when I first met him. He, again, was an athlete, was a great guy, young, very powerful, healthy, all of that stuff. And just comes down with an awful disease that there's no explanation why it happened. It just unfortunately happened. So gets that disease, and I meet him, and it takes time to establish that rapport because, here you are in your 20s being diagnosed with a terrible disease. You're obviously going to be skeptic about everything. Your family is going to be skeptic, all of these things. So anyway, things did go well, and he actually did extremely well, and he's thriving and alive, and we actually stay in touch, and we became friends almost. We are. But a couple of times when I met him and he talked to me, whether in person over a cup of coffee or by text messages, he a couple of times asked me literally, I don't know why I'm here. Like most people who would have the disease I had would have died. And part of him feels guilty about the fact that he would, a lot of people in his situation didn't make it, and he made it. He's happy that he did, but it makes him reflect a little bit, and he gets this remorse almost. So I actually looked into this. I wanted to understand, is this really a true phenomena? Is it, and it's actually real. And a lot of people have written about it. People do have this survival remorse. It's like almost, God forbid, we are on a plane and the plane crashes and everybody dies except like three people. And you start thinking, well, like really the odds are I should have been with them. And here I am. And it's really psychologically challenging. So some people take that energy and say, I'm going to do something bad. And some people might make them depressed. And some people write a book to motivate others. There's a lot of ways to do this. But that story really resonates with me because I think we all sometimes feel that thing like, why am I here? But when you're faced with an illness that almost took your life and it didn't, that thing is amplified.
So much so. I mean, that was my own personal experience coming out of illness and realizing it was connected to environmental toxins. I certainly I wouldn't have been lobbying Congress to clean up our food supply if that hadn't happened. But it's that same kind of thing. It's like, well, why am I still here? Why was I so lucky to regain my health? And it is very, I almost want to say a religious experience. It makes you question what else is there.
I was just going to tell you, it's very similar to yours. I mean, you've had an illness, you've done very well, you found ways to overcome that, but it made you ask questions, and now it became part of your life. It's part of your identity, And we could probably agree that if that didn't happen to you, maybe your path would have been different. I mean, we don't know, but it's possible it could have been completely different. And that's, you ask your question, did I really make it so I could do something different? So that story really resonates. There's a lot of other stories, but that one is difficult to forget.
Well, I'm curious what you have learned about yourself through the process of writing this book and reflecting on your career somewhat. You still have a career ahead of you, but thinking about up to this point, what was that journey like for you as an author?
Uh, I honestly, I never thought I'm going to write 2 books. It's very humbling experience. I never thought anybody would want to read anything I write. So I'm glad that there are few people out there that are willing to read. I noticed how little we know, despite the fact how much we think we know. As you go through everything that you try to write about, you realize that despite all of the progress in the world, there's way more that we need to do. And we tend to always, because we want to try to be optimistic when dealing with cancer, we try to exaggerate the successes as much as possible because it just makes us feel better. But I realize we have a lot of way to go. That's one. The other thing is, I really, as I recounted a lot of the stories, because every story that is written in the book is a true story. There's zero fiction in it. Of course, there's no private information, so nobody will know anything, just basically that I took care of this person or other. I noticed how much I learned from patients. I recounted, how strong they were, how resilient they were, and how grateful they were. I think it's really very humbling. And the third thing is, I think we made a lot of progress. So yes, I say we exaggerate the successes, but we did make a lot of successes. And that is really key. So I write about these. I write about CAR T cellular therapy. I write about a lot of these things. And maybe one last thing, in the chapter that I wrote about complementary and alternative therapies, I really
Yeah, let's dig into that. That's my area.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted, honestly, Kelly, I mean, I wanted to get more information that I'm able to look a patient in the eye and say, if you do this, you're going to do that. If you don't do this, you don't, whatever. I mean, so that is chapter 16. It's called Complementary Alternative Therapy. And again, I talk about stories. I mean, these actual stories I encounter with patients and things like that. But I go over all of these things. I talk about vitamins, dietary supplements, nutritional practices. I go over red meat, high fiber food, alcohol, dairy food, sugar, artificial sweeteners, green tea, ketogenic diet, tomatoes, organic food, cannabis, meditation, massage therapy, yoga, chiropractic, acupuncture. I mean, everything you can think about. And these are important, right? I mean, these are things that people care about. When a patient comes into your office and they ask you about these questions, the worst thing you could do as a physician is to dismiss that. That's not how you deal with it. You have to acknowledge it. You may not agree with it, but acknowledge it and try to figure out how to respond to it. I have to tell you, I noticed there's a very little research, like very solid research being done on all of these. Like, for example, I cannot tell a patient that if you do ketogenic diet, you're going to reduce the risk of cancer. I can tell them if you do ketogenic diet, you are going to lose weight. You are going to probably overcome certain things pertaining to obesity and other things. Now, if this translates indirectly into reducing the risk of other diseases, maybe, but it's hard to actually tell a patient that with an actual evidence. So I was trying to think like, what is the best approach to this? And I think we have to use common sense. Sometimes we don't need always a research study for every single thing to make recommendations to patients because there's not enough resources in the world to have a trial or a study for every single question. It just doesn't exist. So common sense. I mean, if somebody asks me about particular like exercise, I'm like, it's good. You should exercise. I mean, I don't need to cite you a trial to tell you exercise is good, but just be careful about certain things and things like that. I think the ones I struggle with the most are the dietary things. Um, it's There's probably more data on these in more non-cancerous things. Like, I mean, do we know if I don't know, what's your sense about ketogenic diet as an example? Ketogenic diet and organic things. I will try to focus on those. I really spent a lot of times researching these. What's your sense of these in terms of cancer?
Well, this is the problem that the research by and large does not exist. And it tends, I hate the word anecdotal because that makes light of it. Anecdotes can be very real. But certainly you'll see a lot of podcasters and people on social media talking about the different things that they've done. And they, in some cases, haven't even gone down the chemo route. They've been able to cure their cancer through diet change and lifestyle change. Now, that's a risky thing to consider doing, right? But nevertheless, these messages are out there. Unfortunately, there's so much funding coming from big ag and from big food and from pharma that is funding this research that in some cases is there to disprove the fact that a dietary change might decrease your impact of cancer. I mean, it might not, but those pieces of research just aren't executed because there's no money behind them to even get them done because the pharmaceutical companies have no incentive whatsoever to be decreasing their sales of cancer drugs by recommending you go and you eat an organic diet. So it makes it really tricky to go and decipher as a patient or anyone or as a physician what the true impact really is. But I personally am a firm believer that if you feel like something is healing and you know that it's not harmful, so say eating the cleanest food and getting a water filter on your water faucet so that you're drinking only the very cleanest water, particularly when you're struggling with something like cancer, certainly could only benefit just by common sense.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what you want to do, it's totally fine. If that's what makes you feel better, I think I'm okay with it. I just think as a physician, is it really fair to recommend that you need to deprive a patient from particular food? So let me give you an anecdote. So let's say somebody has pancreas cancer or brain cancer. And this individual, unfortunately, we know the prognosis because we haven't made a lot of progress in these particular diseases. Is it really fair to tell this patient not to eat X, Y, Z, D, or to tell them to enjoy the food that they actually enjoy? Now, if they don't want to, it's fine. But patients at that stage, they really want to do anything that you recommend to them as a physician. Is it fair for me to tell this patient, never ever eat an ice cream? You should never have grilled cheese sandwich and French fries, whatever that is. I think it takes a lot to make these recommendations for someone who has cancer and dealing with it. I think your argument is so good before someone is diagnosed. Is there an opportunity to do certain interventions that might reduce the risk of developing certain cancers? So these are two different conversations, I think, right? If you're already diagnosed with cancer, is it really good idea to deprive you from certain things? Sometimes it is. You may want to have like if you're taking lots of prednisone, as an example, maybe you should lower your sugar in the diet because there are other things. Like there's certain logical things. I think people take it to an extreme. What I want to see is more research into, are there any opportunities to do certain things to reduce the risk? And me and you, as an example, being involved in something we both realize that there is. I mean, as an example, glyphosate and Roundup on all of this, there's a big opportunity there to actually help people not develop, lymphoma at least, and maybe other cancers that I have not personally researched. So
Mhm.
that's why I distinguish between those two.
I can see that. I guess I just think just knowing what I know from the environmental contaminants, I think that if if terribly tomorrow I was diagnosed with cancer, it was not terminal. The prognosis we didn't know, and I was going to try and do whatever I could, even if it was light in the research, to try and beat this thing because of my personality, which might be different because I'm someone that would stick to that. But I totally get what you're saying. If you know you likely have 2 years to live and your favorite thing is going down to Taco Bell and having tacos, then like why wouldn't you do that?
Right. I think every case is different, but ultimately it goes back to communication. I think all of us need to sit down, listen. And I said that in a previous podcast. It is important to know the values and what matters to patients best, because that's the only way to help patients. If you really don't know what matters to patients, you can't be their advocate. Me being your advocate, Kelly, it means I know what matters to you. I know what is important to you. So being your advocate is what can I do as your physician to empower you to achieve these values that you care about? And that's really key. And that only happens with communication. And I think, tell you a story. I had a patient. Um, she was in the late 70s, maybe 80 years old. Sweetest patient. I've cared for her for about 5 years. And I think things were starting not to go well. She had a great run. And then we were at a crossroad. I had to switch her to a different chemotherapy. And her daughter is a healthcare professional. So I suggested a chemotherapy regimen, but I told her, look, this one is going to make you lose your hair. She had maintained her hair throughout the first 5 years. She's like, absolutely not. I'm not taking this. Totally. And we went back and forth. Her daughter wasn't too thrilled with that. She was very stubborn. And she said, I love you. I understand why you're trying to do this, but I just really don't want it. I wanna still have my hair appointments. That was important to her. That was part of her personality, part of her values that really she cared about. Now, another person next door may be completely different values. But for her, this was critical. So my job was, as her advocate, is what can I do to help her while assuring that what matters to her is sustained? So we talked about it, and we tried something different that was not really optimal, but it was optimal for her. And that's really part of the communication and understanding that every patient is different. Another story that there are stories, Kelly, that you'll never forget. Honest to God, you'll never forget, no matter what. This was a 65-year-old man that had prostate cancer, and he was on hormonal therapy, and then the hormonal therapy stopped working, and he needed to go on chemotherapy. I didn't even think twice that he's gonna go on chemotherapy. To me, he's 65, he's healthy otherwise. He probably will go on for couple of years with reasonable quality of life, on chemotherapy. There was no way I could convince him. There was it was just like, you know what, I not gonna take it. I'm just gonna go have a good time. And when my time comes, my time comes. And I basically disagreed with that decision. I didn't feel it was the most medically appropriate decision. And he told me, and that's a lesson that we all should learn. He told me, he said, I know that this is not the proper medical decision for a lot of people, but it is the right, proper medical decision for me. And that's key, right? Because you're treating one patient at a time. So knowing what that patient cares about and what matters to this patient is going to really allow you to deliver the best of care. So yeah, lots of lessons learned. I tell you, every single patient have taught me something, and that's why I dedicate the book to them.
If the tone of everything you're saying is the same as the book, I think that everyone's going to love it. Everyone needs a sympathetic and empathetic physician.
It's written from the heart. It's written, and again, the goal of this is just to help people. I think that there are, look, I don't want to get emotional, but there are times where um, I did tear as I was just writing because I would remember the stories. And there are times that wasn't story, it was just explaining facts, like screening for cancer. I talk about stories, but I talk about facts. And I think that patients really, for me, they inspired me. And if anybody is listening to this who I've ever cared for, they really know my values and what matters to me. But ultimately, it's putting yourself in the patient's shoes and realize you could be in that chair. And you will be, by the way, one day, you will be in that chair. Nobody, no one. I hate to break the news to you, listeners and viewers. You're all going to enter the healthcare systems, including me and Kelly. We both have at some point. So our best hope is that when we do, people listen to us. And we're not going to go into Kelly's story much, but Kelly, at some point, when she entered the healthcare system, she was dismissed and laughed at. And that should never happen, right? People should take you seriously and really listen to you. And you know what happened to you in the beginning.
Yeah, I didn't like it. So now forever a patient advocate.
As you should. And I think that's hopefully a lesson to the people who are there. I think, look, sometimes part of it is people are busy, clinics are busy, physicians are swamped with a lot of things. And I think with cancer, how could you take care of somebody if you have like 10 minutes or 15 minutes? So we have to start thinking about, I write actually about in the last chapter, the future of cancer care, about the importance of access and how do you really make sure that we accommodate for the growing number of patients diagnosed, and how do you really accommodate these people? Because we have to. I mean, you can't really
Are
wait.
you seeing, how are the numbers in terms of I hear about this explosion of cancer throughout society. What do those numbers look like?
So we're approaching about 2 million new cancer cases a year.
Oh my gosh.
We're approaching 2 million. I mean, we were always like for 1.7, 1.8 for a while. We're approaching 2 million. It's like 1.98, something like that. The American Cancer Society actually does a good job in keeping the statistics on that. What we're noticing a little bit is more cancer in younger people. Now, that could be a factor of screening. Maybe people are being screened and we're looking for cancer early on in their journey. Or could be that indeed there's something biologically happening in certain people that cancer is being diagnosed early. So there are some investigators focusing on cancer in younger people. In fact, there's an entire thing about the adolescents, and young adult type of cancers. So these are the statistics. So there is increase in the incidence of cancer. At the same time, there's also increase in prevalence because we are curing a lot of cancer. And even if we don't cure it, a lot of patients are living with cancer. So there's actually more patients living with cancer. So you really need to have time, ability to care for them. I actually have that. Let me see where that chapter. That's in 273. I should have been more prepared for this in my own book, but it's actually important to realize the statistics. So there are a lot of people who are actually living with this. So if you look at, so I wrote right here in page 275, to put things in perspective, recent figures suggest that while almost 2 million people in the United States are diagnosed with cancer annually, cancers in general, there are about 18 million people with a history of cancer who live in the United States, which is a sharp increase from only 3 million people living with this disease in 1971. What that means is, although we're diagnosing a little bit more people, but more people are living with it. So now we have to deal with survivorship problems. What are the side effects that could occur from the prior therapies that they received? How do you care for these patients? I'll tell you a story. A patient of mine, young guy, was probably 50 years old when I first met him.
A
And
baby.
yeah, a baby, exactly right, exactly right. But he asked me a question, like, think about it. Like, taking care of a patient. I'm just trying to decide what treatment to give. And he says, so, hey, doc, what do I do with my 401k? And I'm like deer in headlights. I'm like, I didn't even know what to say. I said, I don't know. I said, well, I mean, do I contribute? I mean, I don't need to. I mean, maybe I take the money and do something with it. Do I withdraw the 401k? Does my son get the 401k? I realized that how ill-equipped I was to do this whole caring of patients. I'm like, well, you know what? I need to talk to a financial person or maybe a lawyer, talk to your lawyer, I mean, just do all of this. That actually led to the fact that there is survivorship centers now all across the country where these survivorship centers, they offer classes and information to patients about all of these issues that are really important. Really important. I mean, you want to know about these things. You want to, I taped a podcast with an attorney in California that we talked about what are the rights that patients with cancer have when they're diagnosed with their employer. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
it's really important, right? I mean, you could do the FMLA, do all of these things, but can they let you go? If they're going to have a corporate cut and they're going to let 20 people go, you're probably going to be one of them. I mean, likely.
Yeah.
So I think,
Coincidentally.
right. But there's so many of these things are really critical. So here you are as a patient, you're thinking about all of these things on top of being diagnosed with cancer. We could do a lot better for patients. That's really the spirit of the book. The spirit of the book is, can I really write something to have a guide where if anyone out there who's interested in this, a neighbor, a family member, a patient, whatever it is, they say, you know what, take a look at this book. Maybe there's some information in there that's going to help you. That's really the goal. The goal is, I don't believe there's something like this out there.
So what's your next project? What's book 3?
These two books drained me. I'm not really sure. This one took 3 years, let me tell you. I I haven't thought about, well, there are two things I thought about, honestly, but I just don't know. I need to see if in writing books, you have to really think who you're writing it for and whether there are people who are willing to read it. I don't think I can do fiction. I'm not that talented, but I thought about two things. One is about lessons in healthcare, talk about mentorship, leadership, and things also through storytellings. I like telling stories. People like to hear stories. They don't like to hear lectures. So I wanted to talk like what are like 10 things that I've learned throughout my career and what are really, and bring stories to illustrate each one. Some people say it's too broad because now you talk from a publisher perspective. Is it too broad? Is it this? Is it that? The other possibility is artificial intelligence in healthcare. It's so happening right now. Everybody talks about it. By the time I finish writing the book, I don't know, probably AI would have been like not really so 1999 suddenly. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I will have published your book.
Yeah, these are the two things I really want. I mean, the lessons in healthcare are really, I would love to be able to do that.
Very cool. Well, if I know you, I think that there will be another book. I'll
Lessons
come
from
back
a
on and
humble,
interview you about it.
lessons from a humble career in healthcare.
Perfect. Well, where can people go and find your book?
Everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. It is on Johns Hopkins University Press website. I think I have all of these linked on my website, shadinabhan.com. And
What if people wanted a signed copy?
then what they need to do, they need to get it, reach out to me by Twitter, LinkedIn, or email. And then I'm more than happy to, they can send it to me, I can send it to them, or I'll just send them an extra copy that's copied. More than happy to buy that extra copy for them and send it to them. So Kelly, you're gonna get your signed copy. I'm gonna mail it to
Okay,
you.
that's what I basically wanted to be sure. I was going to get a signed version.
As long as the post office is still open, I'm gonna mail your copy today.
Okay, good. I can't wait.
You just have to tell me you want hardcover or paperback.
I like the hardcover, substantial.
You'll get the hardcover. And by the way, people can listen to me narrating the book. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but hey, if you're going to do the audio, it's going to be me talking.
Well, how is that? How many times do you stutter through things when you're narrating your own book? How many retakes?
It's actually not as bad because it's my own book, like my own words. I think the one thing I've noticed is despite how many times I've gone through the book and like edited and all of these things, there were still some typos, which I'm going crazy
Oh,
about. There's a couple of times where it should be isn't, it was is. I'm like, oh no, my gosh. So there are like about maybe 21 or 22 typos in the entire book. So I wasn't very happy about that, but it is what it is. And but there are few takes usually like in medical terminology. Like I went to a studio and you do the taping, and if like certain things are not clear, they have me repeat it. I still have an accent. Maybe it's not very heavy, but sometimes my like one of my people may laugh at this. One of the things I usually say necessary,
oh,
and it's
kind of
not.
British.
They keep telling me, no, it's necessary. I'm like, oh, it's necessary. And I usually say necessary. I'm like, no, I'm like necessary. Okay, got it. I've done this like 700 times, like necessary. Now I'm like, got it, necessary.
Are you like, why did I write necessary so many times in this book?
I can't tell you how many times I had to repeat this. It's crazy. No, but the audio, the studio was great, and the basically the vendor recorded books were really wonderful to work with. It was great.
Awesome. Well, thanks for letting me come on and interview you about it.
Well, thank you. You're a great host. When are we going to have your podcast?
I don't know. We should definitely book that soon. We'll chat.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Kelly Ryerson, my guest host on Healthcare Unfiltered, talking about the cancer journey. Thanks, Kelly.